Welcome to Haunted Hills Podcast, True Crime from Rosedale, Victoria. When Haunted Hills looks at crimes, it's an interesting reflection on the past, the values, timeliness, and sense of justice. While you're able to play judge and jury, we're not re-adjudicating these crimes. Most of them occurred too long ago for that to be appropriate. However, these discussions create an interesting contrast of values. The offences covered reflect the rural nature of our towns, shedding light on some of the people we don't usually talk about, and what is or was considered criminal at the time. In Rosedale, the locals believe their town was held up on many occasions due to the gold that stopped over on its way back from the goldfields in Walhalla. Let's investigate. Firstly, I'm going to start with a more recent crime from 1951, where 4 men started drinking in the afternoon at Morwell. They're right, all good crime stories don't start with drinking milk. That's the saying, right? Anyway, the Morwell Hotel shut at 6 p.m. The men set out in a taxi to continue their drinking in Rosedale as bona fide travellers. They arrived at the Exchange Hotel, who refused them service. They stumbled over to the Rosedale Hotel. No publican greeted them, but a 1938 Chevrolet's open door beckoned them. They hopped in the Rosedale owner's car, taking turns driving as they all realised how drunk they were. They got as far as Sheepwash Creek, the Rosedale side of Traralgon, where they crashed the car, all while the taxi they paid for was waiting at the Exchange Hotel. The car was worth £500 to £600 at the time. The accident caused £150 worth of damage. It had destroyed the front and right-hand panels of the car, bent the chassis and the radiator. The driver also hit his head on the steering wheel. He revved the engine uselessly, trying to continue drunk driving. An ambulance arrived and assessed the scene and decided to take Martin, the driver at the time, to the hospital. The 3 other men found lifts back to Morwell with another driver. The 4 men were caught and brought before the court. I asked listeners what they thought. You don't have to be sorry, you're allowed to have any opinions you want to have. This is all about your opinions. The Latrobe Valley paranormal detectives said charges they would lay are reckless driving, driving under the influence, car theft, and if they weren't there when the police arrived at the scene, leaving the scene of an accident. Oh, that's a good one. I'm not sure if the police... No, I do believe they'd left the scene before police. And they would sentence 1 year loss of licence and 3 months for each other charge. So 9 months imprisonment all up. We have 1 vote for feeding them Sharktacons. At least they're purple, I like that, and they've got massive teeth. They'd really get through 4 guys. Do they like drunk people? Drunk disorderly, fine them for the damages. That's a more reasonable solution, I think. Way more justice involved in that one, as opposed to a definite death sentence looking at those teeth from the Sharktacons. At the court, the judge noted George, one of the 4 men, didn't have prior convictions. He asked, "Were you in the company of nice criminals?" Yes, it would have been a little patronising. The judge said, "One thing is certain, people who take other people's cars can rest assured that when they come before me in this court, they will go to jail." The paper did not list their ages, but Martin worked as a subcontractor and he lived in Melbourne. He even had his own truck. He was the one who was injured when he hit his head on the steering wheel and was taken to hospital. He had prior convictions in Victoria, Western Australia and Queensland, and as a result was sentenced to 4 months imprisonment. Cousins had 3 prior convictions, also stole a rug from that car. So on the charge of stealing the car, he received 3 months imprisonment, plus an £8 fine or 14 days in prison, on top of the 3 months he'd already served. Thomas had a current bond from the Supreme Court, which is now broken with this new sentence. He was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment. George, who had no priors, was also sentenced to a term of imprisonment for 1 month. A quick note, a bona fide traveller for residents, pubs used to close at 6 p.m. The bona fide traveller was exempt and able to continue drinking, provided they were more than 35 kilometres from their home. That was the local law in the Rosedale area at this time of this crime, but this distance varied over the years and in different areas. Stopping at the pub had to be part of a significant reason for being in the area, as opposed to just finding an open pub for a drink. In the 1940s, the Rosedale Exchange Hotel licensee came unstuck when 4 people claimed they were bona fide travellers. At 9:40 p.m, the police officer investigated why the bar was still open. He obtained the names and addresses of the 4 people at the pub. He discovered the 2 ladies were from St Kilda and Melbourne. However, the 2 men lived in Traralgon. They informed the police officer they had stayed in Melbourne the night before. For those of you who are not local to the Gippsland area, Traralgon is on the road before Melbourne when you're at Rosedale. So these men have driven an extra 20 minutes to go to this pub. So this might be where the law gets glitchy, because while in their minds that made them bona fide travellers, the police officer did not believe that made them bona fide travellers. Even though the law was based on where you slept the night before, the publican, who is a local, should have known these men drove past their home. So this may be why the constable did not agree with the publican, and he said to the publican that he must satisfy himself that the persons before him are bona fide travellers before serving them. This went to court, and the publican was fined £2 and an 11th of the court costs. The 2 men whose addresses were in Traralgon were fined 10 shillings apiece. Anyway, back to theft, or taking things without permission, was a horse theft. In 1889, Martin took a horse for a series of rides across Gippsland on different days without permission. You might call it stealing. However, at the time, the law called it illegally using a horse. And for the record, the horse did not have to be locked up, protest, or say no. Unfortunately, it was not just taking the horse for a ride. He also did not care for it appropriately before or during use. He did not put a blanket under the saddle. This caused a wound to be rubbed into the horse's back. The owner saw the wound and tended to it while he rested his horse. During this time, the owner let the horse recover. Martin again rode the horse, and this time all the way to Yarram, which for those of you who aren't local is over quite a steep mountainous range called the Strzelecki's, and it is very hard going. Today it's still quite steep. However, in 1889 it would have been wombat holes and thick brush. So he rode this horse, pushing it hard to make it there and back in 1 day, which is about a 120 kilometre round trip. This destroyed the horse's joints and back. The injuries were so bad they were beyond repair. The poor mare had to be put down. The horse was worth £12. Oh, I asked listeners what they thought should happen. and here are some of their responses.
Yep, he'd get a fine, shillings, pay £12 and some hard labour.
So at court, a fine of 20 shillings and pay the costs for the horse that at the time was determined to be £8. Martin's age was not listed in the newspaper at this time. I could continue to go on through all the cattle thefts and other things that were stolen, like the railway tarpaulin, but there is no element of interest or surprise in those stories. And there were only 4 bank robberies according to the Rosedale Historical Society, which all seemed rather boring as well. Louisa was 20 years old when she married 44-year-old James in 1875. After a year of marriage, it was on the rocks. Louisa admitted to having an affair with their farmer at the Sale Hotel. This resulted in James and Louisa separating, and Louisa moved in with a different man, a shoemaker. The shoemaker and Louisa also moved into a hotel, which was odd, because the shoemaker had a home. However, for some reason, he decided to lock it up with all his belongings and not invite Louisa back there. This didn't stop Louisa, who helped herself in breaking and entering. She proceeded to steal all his earthly possessions and sell them for £60. Curiously, she wasn't brought up on charges for this, and in return, the shoemaker was not listed as a defendant when James decided to divorce her. However, his application was denied and Louisa returned to James. In 1878, Louisa was charged with horse stealing. One thing she kept straight about this crime was Louisa believed it was a horse given to her by James. She hadn't seen it very often as it stayed on the town commons. Louisa had sold the horse. She spent the proceeds to support her child. When the case went to court, after Annie, the horse's owner, noticed it missing, James gave evidence against Louisa. Her lawyer objected. The buyer spoke at the trial, and he said he hadn't thought it was strange that a woman would be selling a horse. So I asked the listeners what they thought should happen as a result of selling a horse that is not yours. The Latrobe Valley Paranormal Detectives said 6 months hard labour was the usual crime of selling stolen goods, I believe.
Pay £12 and some hard labour. That sounds like a plan. So hard labour was usually in the prisons back in these days.
So at court, it was ruled a mistake, and for each of the parties to deal with their grievances lawfully. The person who accused Louisa withdrew their charge. This same year, she was also charged with assaulting Annie. Louisa said she was atop her horse and could not have assaulted her from that position, and she never dismounted in Annie's presence. Another witness was brought in and gave evidence against Louisa, stating she had gotten off her horse and hit and assaulted Annie. Louisa was fined 10 shillings, and if she couldn't pay, she would serve 12 hours in prison. Louisa sued James for child maintenance, and he was made to pay it. In 1880, Louisa assaulted James and was brought to the court on charges. While James was giving evidence in the witness box, in front of the entire court, Louisa lunged and attacked him. The police struggled to remove her from James. She fought the police, throwing herself around and swinging balled-up fists connecting with the police officers. Finally, she was arrested back to the dock, where she continued making a scene. Louisa threatened to kill James, boasting she'd be glad to do the time if she could kill him. Louisa continued to talk over the proceedings. I asked listeners to comment on what they thought would happen to Louisa as a result of this behaviour. 120 hours of labour, about 3 months' worth of labour. The Latrobe Valley Paranormal Detectives said the behaviour at court would have surely put her in the asylum in those days. Well, she was sentenced to 1 month imprisonment for the assault, then also essentially given a good behaviour bond. However, in 1880, to fulfill the surety, as it was called, you had to pay. Louisa did not have the money. It was £50. If you couldn't pay the surety, you served a prison term based on that amount, which ended up increasing Louisa's prison term by 12 months. When she was released from prison, she sued one of the police officers who worked at the prison for maintenance over the child he impregnated her with during her time in incarceration. Only one paper brought up the issue that has probably been raised in your minds: Louisa's ability to make this choice without coercion. To consent, if you will. The editor of the Kerrang and Swan Hill Gazette noticed it and said, "Immorality by a government official, an instance of immorality in a government establishment, one of the jails of the colony, and by one entrusted with and paid for the prevention of misconduct, together with a gross abuse of a charitable institution." Paternity was determined to be the constable's, and he did have to pay maintenance. However, that is as far as it went. There is no court case, no penalty, no investigation, just really harsh words from the editor of the Kerrang and Swan Hill Gazette. Finally, in 1883, James brought forth an application for divorce because of Louisa's adultery. He added the policeman this time. It still had that farmer listed, and this time it was upheld. Back in 1883, the divorces were only granted in cases of fault, and used terms such as taxed her with adultery. In 1916, Thomas charged John with using abusive language. They were brothers. At court, John admitted to saying those words that were not printed, due to the offensiveness of them at the time. Although calling someone a scab in 1920 could have seen you with a charge of abusive language, John said the reason he had used such language was due to a dreaded fear. His brother had moved the horse from a paddock where John had them grazing, and did not tell him. John informed the court he had gone to Rosedale to lay charges, only to find the constable was in Gormandale, and he was unable to lay his charges, and asserted his brother put charges against him out of spite. At court, John was fined 20 shillings, £3 and 3 shillings court costs, instead of 7 days in prison. Emma married the first settler of the Rosedale area. I can't find his name. What is known is that he was blind in one eye and of Chinese heritage, leading him to have the nickname Blind Joe. It's the name of the creek that crisscrosses Rosedale. Not a lot is known about Emma either, except that in 1859 she was drinking so much and using expletives it brought her to the attention of the Sale Police Court. She had sworn at a police officer who had suggested she go home. I asked the listeners what they thought should happen as a result of this crime. A suggestion by a listener was the stocks for 2 hours per day. The purpose of the stocks was to publicly shame a person. This punishment ceased to be used in Victoria, Australia by 1886, so it could have actually been a potentiality for Emma at this stage. We also stopped using public hangings by 1886 because they became riotous as the public rebelled against the spectacle, which is why after 1886 hangings were conducted in prisons. Before I tell you what Emma was sentenced, I just want to let you know another man for the same behaviour was fined £5 and warned if he continued he'd receive a prison term of 3 months. As far as I can tell, this is the only time Emma was in trouble with the police. So, the result for Emma was 3 months in prison at Alberton. The prison at Alberton was actually just the police lockup. It had 4 rooms, which housed more than 4 people. It was such a terrible place that Angus Macmillan advocated it should be shut down, and they should not have that many people in there. Let's look at murders or gun crimes. which occurred in the Rosedale area. In 1929, the brother of Andrew Fisher, the Rosedale Shire president, was shot. Albert retired to his room with his wife for the night, when 16-year-old farmhand Ernie called, saying, "Boss, come look at this." Albert left his room. Not long after leaving, a gunshot rang out. Albert slammed the bedroom door shut and said to his wife, "Good God, Ernie has shot me." His wife tended to his badly damaged arm. They left the house, fearing Ernie would break into their room and fire more shots. Mrs. Fisher returned to the house first, finding Ernie on the porch, clutching the smoking rifle. She asked him to put the gun down. He did. Mrs. Fisher picked it up, disarming it. She left the live cartridge on the porch. Albert had come up behind her and asked Ernie to get the car ready. Ernie pushed it out of the garage and started it. Albert drove them to another property, where the doctor met them. The doctor completed first aid and stabilized him, then took him to Gippsland Hospital for amputation because of the extent of the injuries to his arm and shoulder. The police took Ernie into custody and asked him, "Why did you shoot your boss?" He said he didn't remember shooting Albert. He only noticed Albert was injured, as blood dripped from his hand when he got out of the car at the farmer's house. Ernie was charged with seriously wounding Albert. Albert unfortunately succumbed to the injuries and never recovered. He died. The charges were upgraded for Ernie to manslaughter. Ernie said he didn't remember talking to Albert after they'd retired to bed, until he was asked to get the car. Ernie gave no reason for his actions. The court suggested he sleptwalk or was maybe insane. After 3 weeks of tests, the doctors found him, quote-unquote, normal, but noted he was apathetic and dull, or indifferent to what had happened. So I asked listeners what they thought. The Latrobe Valley Paranormal Detectives said they would need more details before passing judgment, but on the charge of manslaughter, 10 years, and if murder to 25 to life.
Manslaughter jail term.
The jury in 1929 found Ernie not guilty for reason of insanity. The judge sentenced Ernie to a custodial sentence at the governor's pleasure, essentially an indefinite sentence for his entire life. In 1923, a new doctor started his Rosedale practice. He originally practiced from his mother-in-law's property. However, for some reason, not disclosed, he was kicked out of there after his daughter was born. His wife, mother-in-law and daughter all continued to live there. However, he moved into a large brick home on Princes Street, Rosedale, near the Bunya Pine Tree, where he and his housekeeper would perform some procedures on women there that were illegal at the time. There are 3 known occasions. 2 resulted in deaths of the women. They were investigated as murders. The first death was 11 years after his practice commenced. In 1934, Catherine was 36 and married. She'd been living with her brother in Bairnsdale when she headed to Rosedale to see the doctor for the £15 procedure. The court would later confirm she'd been pregnant. She already had 3 children who were 7 years, 14 and 15 years old. The inquest discovered Catherine's kidneys were giving her trouble. After the procedure, the doctor suggested she stay at the boarding house opposite the school to recover before going back to Bairnsdale. In her sleep, she hemorrhaged and never woke up. Before leaving her brother's home, she didn't mention feeling unwell. He said she'd told him she was going to Melbourne. The doctor didn't even know Catherine's name. He only knew her by the last name, and couldn't find anyone in Bairnsdale with that name, because she'd used her married name. A resident at the pub suggested he look through her purse to see if there's an address or next of kin listed. This is when they found her brothers and informed them of her passing. Her brother was called to the Rosedale Hotel. Upon his arrival, he found the doctor drunk, who admitted that during the procedure, her organs had been nicked, that led to the internal hemorrhaging, and wasn't noticed until the boarding house keeper found her the next morning. This went to court. Bail was set for £200. The trial set for April 1934. I asked the listeners what they thought.
Doctor, shot, drop, and stop. Like stop, drop, and roll.
However, when it went to court, the charges were withdrawn. 2 years later, that makes it 1936, this happened again, only this time he had the presence of mind to monitor the woman more closely and send her to the Gippsland Hospital when he realised things were going wrong. Kathleen was 40 when she sought the services of the Rosedale doctor. She lived in Sale with her husband and 3 children, aged between 11 and 15 years old. She'd been ill for a few weeks and told her family she was going to Maui. After the procedure, the doctor realised she was very ill and unlikely to recover. He sent her to the Sale Hospital. When he received word she'd died, he injected himself with a cocktail of drugs. His housekeeper found him on the edge of consciousness. The doctor at Sale refused to issue a death certificate, saying he did not believe the Rosedale doctor about what had happened and ordered an autopsy. On the day the trial rolled around, her husband, a railway worker, was to give evidence. When he didn't appear at court, they searched for him and found him in his shed, lying on the ground beside the shotgun that took his life. The doctor submitted evidence in court saying Kathleen had said she just needed a clean out following a miscarriage, not a termination, and that he'd been misled. The prosecution decided to withdraw the charges permanently. In 1949, another woman under the care of the Rosedale doctor resulted in requiring medical treatment. The young woman came with her partner for a procedure to save her life. I don't really want to tell her age or more details about her because I know she actually might still be with us, as with her partner. Again, something went wrong, and the doctor sent her to Sale Hospital for recovery. The doctors were suspicious of how the young woman came to have the internal damage. This led to an investigation that resulted in the doctor getting a charge of illegally using an instrument alongside his housekeeper who had assisted him. So I asked the listeners what they thought, and here's their answers.
Why didn't that doctor lose his license? Hopefully it was more than a fine.
During this case, there was a jury convened. However, it was split. They could not come to an agreement. So, as a result of this, he was acquitted. In 1969, a court case was the common law in Victoria that was won to allow for these procedures to legally take place in some instances, usually relating to the health of the woman. The last crime story for Rosedale contains a discharged gun, a firefight in the main street of Rosedale. Is this one of the bank robberies? Let's have a look. At 12:40 a.m. 1944, the Rosedale mechanic William Holloway heard something. He went out to investigate. From his vantage point, he could hear and see shadowy forms of the bandits in his garage. He went back into his house, grabbed his shotgun, and asked his wife to call the police. He went back outside. "Stop, or I'll shoot!" With a clear view of the garage, he could hear and see the shadowy forms of the bandits. When the 4 men walked into view, instead of putting their hands up, the gang fired 15 bullets in William's direction. He returned fire twice. First, shot at the wheels of the car. A satisfying sound told him he hit his mark as the tire deflated. The second shot was low and aimed at the legs of the men. He knew he hit his mark as a man howled in pain. The would-be thieves abandoned the stolen car and headed off into the bush on foot. A search of the vehicle revealed it contained all the things a gang of thieves on a spree across Gippsland needed, including drums of fuel stolen from the Sale depot the night before, including explosives for blowing open safes. So I asked the listeners what they thought, and here's their answers.
Bandits probably got theft, an attempted murder, or probably a fine.
William's actions helped catch 3 of the 4 men within 2 days. Mrs. Holloway was also thanked for her part in stopping the crime. For the listeners' interest, All of the men were employed at the time of their burglary across Gippsland, and they were not local to the Gippsland area. Thank you, listeners, for your time and your ears. I hope you've had a fascinating journey through the Rosedale Crime. Not all of them were small time. I hope wherever you were it was entertaining. If you want to support the podcast, you can sign up on Patreon or write a review. This podcast was produced, researched, written and narrated by me, Tegan Dawson, on Gunai land in Victoria Moe, never ceded. Sound engineering and music by Aaron Austin Music. Next time on Haunted Hills, we'll be telling the ghost stories of Rosedale. This small town has big stories. I appreciate you all. You can follow us for more small towns big stories on the socials, Facebook, Haunted Hills Pod, Twitter @haunt_hills, or our pod website, hauntedhillstours.com.au. Be kind, thoughtful, stay healthy and safe.